Hi everyone, my name is John. Welcome back to another book review for March 16th, 2022. Today I want to talk about a book that was read by me in sort of an ongoing interest I have with the English Revolution. And it is by maybe one of the preeminent historians of the period and historians of the Revolution specifically, but also just the 17th century more broadly. In fact, Martin Kettle of The Guardian says on the cover, no less, that Christopher Hill, the author of the book, is the reason why most of us know anything at all about the 17th century in England. And the book is, that might be a bit of an overstatement, but the book is Christopher Hill's The World Turned Upside Down. The subtitle is Radical Ideas During the English Revolution. There you can see a bit of torture going on. A woodcut, I think. So this is sort of some of the... You can sort of think of Bernard Bailyn's, intellectual or ideological underpinnings of the, what's that book called? It has the word ideological history of the American Revolution. This is sort of the English Revolution equivalent. Okay, so it looks at prominent cultural, historical, literary ideas that are going on, of course, since it's during the English Revolution, mostly during the mid-17th century. But he does sort of talk at both ends of the Revolution, too. Christopher Hill's life work. Christopher Hill, by the way, died in 2003, was born in 1912, was spent almost entirely on a reevaluation of a certain time and place, and that was England in the 17th century. A really fascinating time and place. By 1972, the year this book was published, this is the 50th anniversary of the book's publication, he had written already nearly a dozen books, more than half of them about the culture, society, and intellectual life of England at that time. The World Turned Upside Down mostly examines the new, or what were then new and radically sectarian Protestant ideas that contributed to the revolutionary atmosphere of, the beheading of the king, and then several years later the Restoration. If you want a good description of the basic revolutionary groups mostly mentioned in this period, this book does the job, but it's not exactly what most people would consider an introduction. I'll talk about that in a second. For those completely new to the subject, sometimes his explanations run together a bit more than they should. So, for example, he talks about the Diggers, the group, the Christian communitarian sect that first got its name by taking control of some of the common lands abutting the Thames and started planting their crops there. Before long, dozens of other sites had been similarly commandeered, an idea that might be shocking if a full third of all English land hadn't been commons that were just sort of laying about similarly unused. And then he goes on to describe the beliefs of the Ranters, the Seekers, the Quakers, the Muggletonians, and a whole scat of other revolutionary groups and schools, the whole time sort of emphasizing some of their common traits, which, depending on what group you belong to, usually many of the commonalities revolved around sex. They had some incredibly open-minded ideas about sex. I don't know if I want to call them progressive or liberal, but They were very much free sex, free, like, open, free love, that sort of thing. Doesn't sound like the 1660s, it sounds like the 1960s in this book a lot of the time. And private property, they also very much called into question, too. Like I said, the diggers were a group of Christian communitarians who shared their property and basically shared their belongings. So I was kind of unfamiliar with a lot of what the groups believed, and one of the big takeaways from the book was exactly how entrenched they got into the Bible to actually critique the way that they lived their lives. A lot of these people, a lot of the revolutionaries thought that English society in the 17th century was just not Christian enough, was just not biblical enough, and therefore needed to become anti-private property and pro-free sex, like the Bible says you should live. I think it kind of goes to show that the Bible is just one of those. I don't call it a book because it's really 60-something different books, but it's a resource you can go to and kind of read anything you want to out of it, because so many things have been read into it. This just being one more example of a plethora of examples. Being a Marxist and having more than a revisionist tint to him, Christopher Hill freely uses the word communist to describe many of the people's beliefs that he's talking about. And I think this is probably somewhat of ex post facto confirmation bias. He's a Marxist, and he sees, free love and a critique of private property, and sort of wants to use that word too. If you want to call them Marxists, I guess, but I mean, they have no conception of Marx's, philosophy of history or anything. They might have a bare critique of his conception of critique of capitalism, but to call them Marxists is a little bit like I said, a result of confirmation bias. And now that I'm thinking about it, he may not even use the word Marxist. He might just call them communist. But I guess if you're using it in a certain very delineated sense, it applies. Whatever it is, it was at least a really heterodox form of religious practice that sometimes disposed of the most fundamental Christian assumptions, like private property, like the fact that capitalism was the economic system de rigueur and was certified by God and also by the king, and that's all you needed to know. Well, they rejected that, many of them. And another big takeaway from the book is that the radicals of the time were beginning to question what used to be thought of as their preordained hierarchies and roles in society. This goes back to the sort of free love thing. And slowly but surely figured out that institutions of law, government, culture, private property are really nothing more than what people themselves have defined them to be into existence. I mean, laws are social constructs, societies are social constructs, cultures are cultural constructs. We create them because we think that they add some sort of value added to our society, and thus we defend them as such. But at the end of the day, that doesn't detract from the fact that they are invented. They are inventions. The World Turned Upside Down is often passed off as an introduction to the English Revolution and the ideas that sort of propelled it forward. But I would argue that without some previous grounding in the history of the time, some readers are going to be left a bit far afield. I don't think for me it's much of an entry point. Nor is it so scholarly, though, that I would call it a monograph, which it's certainly not. It's an approachable book for the somewhat previously informed reader. I'm guessing the reason why it has the reputation it does as an introduction comes from the sheer number of people it's influenced, historians and students, in the 50 years that since it's been published. I mean, you can find, if you pick, if you pick up a random book about the English Revolution published in the last 49 years, this book will be in the notes or in the bibliography somewhere. I almost guarantee it. For anyone interested in thick, hardy histories of England in the 17th century, the just wonderful people over at Verso Press have done the world a great favor by republishing much of Christopher Hill's work, including Experience and Defeat, Milton and His Contemporaries, Liberty Against the Law, Some 17th Century Controversies, Society and Puritanism in Pre-Revolutionary England, Reformation to Industrial Revolution, A Turbulent, Seditious, and Factious People, which is Hill's book on John Bunyan, and last but not least, Milton and the English Revolution. So they have published, what's that, 5 or 6 really great books that double down on Hill's interest in 17th century England. They're big, thick, meaty, usually a bit more scholarly than this, but not so bad for the average reader who's just really interested in the period like me. In and of themselves, they look like, to give them sort of a cursory inspection, they look like a nearly complete education in social, cultural, and intellectual history of the time. And over the next several years, as I read them, I plan to work through them with the care and the appreciation that they deserve. I've already bought one. I think the one I bought was called Experience and Defeat, Milton and His Contemporaries. But I will have to go and double check that. In my Verso haul, I showed it, so I'm forgetting which one it was at the moment. But I will be back next week with another book review, hopefully on time. We'll see how that goes. And I will see you later. Bye, everyone.